Michael stood in his empty garage, staring at the oil stains on the concrete where his toolbox used to sit. The funeral program for Sarah crumpled in his left hand, black ink smearing across his palm from where tears had fallen 3 hours earlier. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Danny, his 24-year-old son, asking when he'd be back from Mom's thing. The garage door was still open, exactly as he'd left it when the call came that Sarah had finally lost her battle with cancer. 48 hours ago, he'd been here organizing his Craftsman wrenches by size, the same ritual that had grounded him through 30 years of marriage, 18 months of divorce proceedings, and now 6 weeks of widowhood. Sarah wasn't technically his widow. The papers had been signed before she got sick, but grief didn't recognize legal distinctions. Michael's hands shook as he pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos he'd taken of his tool collection for insurance purposes. Every socket, every drill bit, every level, cataloged with serial numbers he'd meticulously recorded in a spiral notebook that lived in the kitchen junk drawer. Sarah used to tease him about it, calling him obsessive. "What are you going to do, file a police report if someone steals your hammer?" she'd laughed. Now, standing in the hollow echo of his stripped garage, he knew exactly what he was going to do. The drive to Danny's apartment complex took 12 minutes, but Michael had rehearsed the conversation 100 times. His son had always been careless with money, dropping out of community college twice, bouncing between restaurant jobs and get-rich-quick schemes. But this crossed a line that went beyond irresponsibility into something darker. Michael parked his Ford F-150 next to Danny's rusted Honda Civic and noticed the new rims, chrome spinners that probably cost more than Danny made in a month at the pizza place. Danny answered the door in boxer shorts and a stained undershirt, squinting against the afternoon sun. His dark hair, so much like Sarah's, stuck up at odd angles, and the apartment behind him reeked of stale beer and marijuana. "Hey, Dad, how was the funeral? Sorry I couldn't make it, but you know how things are with work and—" "Where are my tools, Danny?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke. Danny's bloodshot eyes flickered, and Michael saw the exact moment his son realized the game was over. It was the same look Danny had worn at 8 years old when Sarah caught him stealing quarters from her purse. Guilt and defiance wrestling for control of his features. "What tools? I don't know what you're talking about." Michael pulled out his phone and showed Danny the insurance photos. Craftsman socket set, model number 944713. DeWalt cordless drill, serial number DW08244. Milwaukee impact driver, serial number 286-22. I've got serial numbers for everything, son. Everything. Danny's face went pale beneath his stubble. "Dad, listen, I can explain." "Explain what? That while I was burying your mother, you cleaned out my garage? That you sold 30 years' worth of tools so you could buy those ridiculous rims?" Michael's voice cracked, but he pressed on. "Your mother died, Danny. Your mother died, and instead of being there for her funeral, you were hawking my property to God knows who?" "She wasn't my real mom," Danny muttered, looking at his feet. "And you guys were divorced anyway. She was nothing to me." The words hit Michael like a physical blow. Sarah had raised Danny from the time he was 7, after Danny's biological mother abandoned them both for a meth habit and a boyfriend in Nevada. Sarah had packed his school lunches, attended his baseball games, stayed up nights helping him with homework he was too proud to ask Michael for help with. She'd loved that boy with a fierce, protective intensity that had sometimes made Michael jealous. "Nothing to you," Michael repeated quietly. "The woman who drove 2 hours every week to visit you in county lockup when you got picked up for shoplifting. The woman who co-signed for your car loan when no bank would touch you. The woman who cried herself to sleep when you dropped out of school the second time. Nothing to you." Danny shifted his weight, crossing his arms defensively. "Look, I needed the money, okay? I got behind on rent, and Craig said he knew a guy who buys tools, no questions asked. I figured you had insurance or whatever. Rich guys like you always have insurance." "Rich guys like me?" Michael almost laughed. "Son, I'm a machinist at a plant that's been talking layoffs for 2 years. I drive a 10-year-old truck with 180,000 miles on it. Those tools, they were my retirement plan. Every socket wrench, every drill bit. I was planning to sell them when I couldn't work anymore." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of traffic from the main road and a dog barking somewhere in the complex. Michael studied his son's face, looking for some sign of remorse, some indication that the boy Sarah had loved was still buried somewhere beneath the selfish stranger standing in front of him. "I can get them back," Danny said finally. "Craig's probably still got most of them. He runs that pawn shop on Riverside." "Don't," Michael said. "Don't make this worse by lying to me. You know as well as I do that stuff's long gone. Probably sold to contractors or weekend warriors who don't know they're buying stolen goods." Danny's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it instinctively. Michael caught a glimpse of the screen, a text from someone named Crystal with a photo attachment that made Danny's cheeks redden. "New girlfriend?" Michael asked. "Let me guess, she needed money for something too. Rent, drugs, whatever. And my son, the stand-up guy, decided to rob his own father to impress some girl he'll forget about in 3 months." "It's not like that," Danny protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Crystal's different. She's got potential. She's starting her own business, selling jewelry online, and she just needed a little startup capital." "Jesus Christ, Danny! You sold my tools to fund some girl's pyramid scheme?" Michael rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. "How much did you get for everything?" "I don't know. Craig gave me like $800 cash." $800? 30 years of carefully maintained tools worth at least $5,000 sold for $800 cash to a fence who probably flipped them for triple that within a week? Michael thought about the hours he'd spent cleaning and organizing those tools, the satisfaction of having exactly the right wrench for every job, the pride he'd felt in owning quality equipment that would last a lifetime. "Your mother wanted to be cremated," Michael said quietly. "Did you know that? She was terrified of being buried underground, claustrophobic even thinking about it. But she never told you because she didn't want to upset you with talk about dying." Danny shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, I don't want to hear about. She asked me to scatter her ashes at Lake Millfield, where we used to take you fishing when you were little. Remember those trips? You'd complain the whole time about being bored, but Sarah would pack those elaborate picnic lunches and bring books to read while we fished. She said those were some of the happiest days of her life." Michael's voice broke slightly, and he had to pause to compose himself. The grief was still too fresh, too raw. 3 days ago, Sarah had been alive, asking him to adjust her pillows in the hospital bed, complaining about the terrible coffee in the cafeteria. Now she was ash in a ceramic urn on his kitchen counter, waiting for a memorial service that her own son couldn't be bothered to attend. "She left you something," Michael continued. "$5,000 in a savings account she'd been building for years. She wanted you to have it. Said maybe it would help you get back on your feet, go back to school, or start a legitimate business." Danny's eyes widened. "5,000? She never said anything about—" "Because she knew you'd spend it before she was cold in the ground, just like you spent my tools." Michael pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. "But I'm not giving it to you. Not now. Maybe not ever." "You can't do that." Danny's voice rose, attracting attention from a neighbor who'd stepped onto her balcony to smoke. "That money's mine. She left it to me." "Actually, she left it to me, with instructions to give it to you when I thought you were ready. And son, you are nowhere near ready." The truth was more complicated than Michael was letting on. Sarah had indeed left Danny $5,000, but she'd also left detailed instructions about conditions for its release. Danny had to complete either a college degree or a trade certification program. He had to maintain steady employment for at least 6 months, and he had to write a letter acknowledging the harm he'd caused through his various mistakes and outlining concrete steps for making amends. Sarah had been an elementary school teacher for 20 years before the cancer forced her into early retirement. She understood consequences and accountability better than anyone Michael had ever known. Even facing death, she'd been trying to teach Danny one last lesson. "This is bullshit," Danny said, his voice getting louder. "You're just pissed because I didn't come to the funeral of some woman who wasn't even related to me. Fine, whatever. I'll get my own money. Crystal's business is going to take off, and we won't need handouts from bitter old men who—" Michael's hand shot out and grabbed Danny by the front of his undershirt, pulling him close enough that Michael could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. For a moment, father and son stared at each other. 30 years of disappointment and love and frustration crackling between them like electricity. "That woman," Michael said quietly, "loved you more than your biological mother ever did. She loved you more than you've ever loved anyone in your selfish, worthless life. And while she was dying, Danny, she was worried about you. Worried about your future, your happiness, your ability to become a decent human being. Her last coherent words to me were about you." Michael released his grip and stepped back, watching Danny smooth his shirt with shaking hands. The neighbor on the balcony had been joined by another woman, both of them openly staring now at the drama unfolding in the courtyard. "What did she say?" Danny asked, his voice smaller now, some of the bravado leaking out of him. "She said, 'Don't give up on him, Michael. He's got good in him, somewhere, deep down. I've seen it. Even at the end, even after all the ways you disappointed her, she still believed in you." Michael felt tears threatening again and forced them back. He'd done enough crying at the funeral, surrounded by Sarah's teacher friends and her book club and her sister from Oregon. People who'd actually known her, who'd taken the time to say goodbye properly. "I want you to think about something," Michael continued. "While you and Crystal were planning how to spend $800 in stolen goods, I was holding Sarah's hand in a hospice room that smelled like disinfectant and death. She weighed 93 pounds, Danny. 93 pounds, down from the 140 she'd been when the divorce was finalized. And she spent her last day on Earth worrying about you." Danny's lower lip trembled, and for a moment he looked like the scared 7-year-old who'd hidden behind Sarah's legs the first time Michael brought him home. But the moment passed, replaced by the sullen defensiveness that had become Danny's default expression over the past few years. "I never asked her to worry about me," he muttered. "No, you never asked for anything except money and second chances and someone to clean up your messes." Michael pulled out his phone and opened his contacts. "I'm calling the police. Grand theft, probably. Maybe receiving stolen goods, too, depending on what Craig's willing to admit to." "Dad, you can't! I'm your son!" "Are you? Because sons show up for their mother's funerals. Sons don't steal from their fathers. Sons don't break the hearts of the women who raised them." Michael's thumb hovered over the call button. "Sarah begged me not to involve the cops the last time you got in trouble. Said it would ruin your chances of getting your life together. But Sarah's not here anymore to protect you." Danny was crying now, ugly sobs that made his whole body shake. "Please, Dad, please don't call them. I'll figure out how to get your tools back. I'll work extra shifts. I'll borrow money from Crystal's dad. Crystal's dad? The one who runs the auto parts store that's been investigated twice for selling stolen merchandise?" Michael shook his head. "Son, you don't even realize how deep you're sinking. You think this is all some game, some temporary rough patch before you hit it big. But this is your life. This is who you've chosen to be." The phone rang twice before a dispatcher answered. "911, what's your emergency?" "I need to report a theft," Michael said, keeping his eyes locked on Danny's face. My son stole approximately $5,000 worth of tools from my garage while I was attending a funeral. Danny lunged forward, trying to grab the phone, but Michael sidestepped easily. The boy had never been athletic, despite Michael's attempts to get him interested in sports. Sarah had been the one to suggest music lessons, art classes, anything to find Danny's passion. But passion required commitment, and commitment had never been Danny's strong suit. "Sir, can you give me your location?" the dispatcher asked. Michael rattled off Danny's address, watching his son pace frantically around the small patio. The neighbors had given up any pretense of privacy and were leaning over their balcony railing to get a better view of the show. "I have units en route," the dispatcher said. "Can you stay on the line until they arrive?" "Yes, ma'am." Danny stopped pacing and stared at his father with something approaching hatred. "I hope you're happy," he said. "I hope this makes you feel like a big man, sending your own son to jail." "I feel like a failure," Michael replied honestly. "I feel like I failed you, and I failed Sarah, and I failed every value I tried to teach you. But I'm done enabling your choices. Sarah died believing you could change, but I don't think you want to." In the distance, Michael could hear sirens approaching. The sound made his chest tight. He'd never called the police on family before, never imagined a scenario where his own son would force his hand like this. But the tools weren't really the point anymore. They were just metal and plastic, replaceable if he was willing to start over from scratch. The real theft had been something much more valuable: trust, respect, the basic human decency that should exist between a father and son. Two patrol cars pulled into the complex parking lot, their blue and red lights casting strange shadows across the courtyard. Michael watched the officers get out, checking their equipment with the casual efficiency of people who'd responded to domestic disputes 1,000 times before. One was young, probably not much older than Danny, with a military haircut and polished boots. The other was older, graying at the temples, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who'd seen enough family tragedies to know they never ended well. "You called about a theft?" the older officer asked, approaching Michael with his notebook already out. "Yes, sir. My son sold my tools while I was at a funeral yesterday. I have serial numbers and photos for everything that was taken." The officer looked between Michael and Danny, taking in the family resemblance, the obvious tension, the neighbors who were still watching from their balconies like it was primetime television. "Son, is this your father?" the officer asked Danny. Danny nodded miserably, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "And did you take his tools?" A long pause. Michael could almost see Danny's mind working, calculating odds, looking for an angle that might get him out of this mess. But there was nowhere to run, no story that would explain away the empty garage, or the new rims on his car, or the $800 he'd already spent. "Yeah," Danny said finally, "I took them. But he's my dad. It's not like I robbed a stranger or something." The younger officer stepped forward. "Theft is theft, sir. Family relationship doesn't change the law." "My tools are my livelihood," Michael explained. "I do automotive repair work on weekends to supplement my income. Without those tools, I can't work." It wasn't entirely true. Michael could borrow tools from friends or buy cheaper replacements if necessary. But the principle mattered more than the practicality. Danny needed to understand that actions had consequences, that there were lines you didn't cross, even within a family. The older officer was studying Michael's face with the knowing look of someone who'd raised his own children through difficult times. "How long has this been going on?" he asked quietly. "The stealing? This is the first time he's taken anything significant from me. But the lying, the irresponsibility, the complete disregard for other people, that's been building for years." "Dad, please," Danny said, fresh tears streaming down his face. "Don't do this. I'll pay you back, I swear. Just give me time." Time for what? Time to find another family member to rob? Time to drag Crystal deeper into whatever scheme you're running? Michael shook his head. Son, I've given you nothing but time. 24 years of time. And look what you've done with it. The officers exchanged glances, having one of those wordless conversations that experienced partners develop over years of working together. Michael could guess what they were thinking. Another family dispute that would probably be dropped before it got to court, another domestic situation that would waste everybody's time and solve nothing. Sir, the older officer said to Michael, you have the right to press charges, and we'll support that if it's what you want to do. But I have to ask, is this really how you want to handle this? Once we arrest him, there's no taking it back. The system takes over, and family relationships, well, they don't usually survive intact. Michael looked at his son, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Danny was thin, too thin, with dark circles under his eyes and skin that had the grayish pallor of someone who spent too much time indoors. His hands were shaking slightly, from fear, from whatever substances he'd been using, or from withdrawal. The boy was a mess, had been a mess for longer than Michael had wanted to admit. But underneath the stubble and the bloodshot eyes and the stained clothes, Michael could still see traces of the kid who'd once begged to help with oil changes, who'd proudly worn a junior mechanic's shirt to kindergarten, who'd fallen asleep in the garage while Michael worked on the truck. That boy had existed once, had been real, had shown promise. Sarah would have found a way to reach him, Michael thought. Sarah had always been better with people, better at finding the good in situations that seemed hopeless. She'd been the one to talk Michael out of sending Danny to military school after the shoplifting incident, the one to insist on counseling instead of punishment, the one to keep believing even when Danny made believing almost impossible. But Sarah was gone, and Michael was tired of being the only adult in the relationship. "Do it," he said to the officers. "Arrest him." The younger officer moved behind Danny and began the familiar ritual of handcuffs and Miranda rights. Danny didn't resist, just stood there crying while his neighbors recorded everything on their phones. Michael wondered how long it would take for the video to end up on social media. Another piece of family tragedy turned into entertainment for strangers. "You have the right to remain silent," the officer recited. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "Dad," Danny said, looking over his shoulder as the officer guided him toward the patrol car. "Dad, please, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry." Michael nodded. "I know you are, son, but being sorry isn't enough anymore." The arrest took another 20 minutes. Paperwork, inventory of Danny's belongings, contact information for lawyers and bail bondsmen. Michael answered questions mechanically, providing serial numbers and receipts and everything else the legal system would need to prosecute his own child. It felt surreal, like watching someone else's life play out in slow motion. When the patrol cars finally pulled away, Michael stood alone in the parking lot of his son's apartment complex, holding keys to a place he'd never been invited to visit. The neighbors had gone back inside, the show over, leaving him with nothing but the sound of traffic and the weight of what he'd just done. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister in Arizona. How was the service? Sarah would have been proud of how beautiful everything was. Michael stared at the screen, trying to think of how to respond. How do you explain that while one family tragedy was ending, another was just beginning? How do you tell someone that you'd spent the morning burying the woman who'd held your family together, and the afternoon having your son arrested? Instead of responding, he drove home to his empty house and sat in his empty garage, looking at the oil stains where his toolbox used to be. The funeral program was still crumpled in his pocket, along with the envelope containing information about Sarah's final wishes. Tomorrow, he would have to call a lawyer about Danny's case, research bail procedures, and probably empty his savings account to hire legal representation for a son who'd stolen from him while he grieved. But tonight, he just sat in the silence, thinking about second chances and consequences and the difference between love and enabling. Sarah would have found another way, he was sure of that. Sarah would have somehow reached Danny without destroying what was left of their relationship. But Sarah hadn't been there to see the look of entitled indifference on Danny's face when he dismissed her as nothing. She hadn't heard him blame everyone but himself for his problems, hadn't watched him turn even grief into an opportunity for personal gain. Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Danny's number. For a moment, he considered calling the jail, finding out about visiting hours, starting the process of rebuilding whatever could be salvaged from the wreckage of their relationship. Instead, he deleted the number and went inside to make dinner for one. 3 days later, Michael received a call from a defense attorney named Roberts who'd been assigned to Danny's case. The charges were serious, grand theft, since the total value exceeded $5,000. But Roberts thought he could negotiate a plea deal if Michael was willing to be flexible about sentencing. "Your son has no prior felony convictions," Roberts explained over the phone. "If he pleads guilty and agrees to make restitution, we might be able to get him probation and community service instead of jail time." Michael listened to the lawyer's pitch, thinking about Sarah's savings account and the conditions she'd set for Danny's inheritance. $5,000 would cover full restitution for the tools, with enough left over for Danny to start fresh if he was serious about changing his life. "What kind of restitution are we talking about?" Michael asked. "Full value of the stolen items, based on your insurance documentation, probably around $5,000, payable over 2 years. It would work out perfectly, Michael realized. Danny could use Sarah's inheritance to pay back what had stolen, completing the circle of responsibility that Sarah had tried to create with her carefully worded will. The irony was almost poetic. The money she'd left to help Danny get his life together would instead go to compensating his victim, who happened to be his own father. "I need to think about it," Michael told Roberts. "Of course, but don't wait too long. The prosecutor is eager to make an example of family theft cases. They think it sends a message about respecting your elders." That afternoon, Michael drove to the jail to visit Danny for the first time since the arrest. The facility was newer than he'd expected, all concrete and steel and fluorescent lights that made everyone look pale and sick. Michael had to surrender his keys and wallet, pass through metal detectors, and submit to a pat-down search that made him feel like he was the criminal. Danny looked terrible. His hair was greasy, his orange jumpsuit hung loose on his thin frame, and he had a bruise under his left eye that suggested jail wasn't agreeing with him. But for the first time in years, his eyes were clear. No bloodshot haze of marijuana or alcohol, no darting glances that suggested he was high or coming down from something. They sat across from each other at a scratched metal table, separated by thick glass and connected by phones that made everything sound hollow and distant. "How are you holding up?" Michael asked. Danny shrugged. "Could be worse, I guess. My cellmate's in for check fraud, so at least he's not violent. Food's terrible, though." "Your lawyer called me. Roberts. He thinks he can get you a plea deal." "Yeah, he mentioned that. Probation and community service if I pay you back." Danny paused, studying his father's face through the glass. "Do you want me to take it?" It was a good question, and one Michael had been wrestling with since Roberts called. Part of him wanted Danny to face the full consequences of his actions, to spend time in prison understanding exactly how serious theft was. But another part of him, the part that Sarah had always appealed to, wanted his son to have another chance to make things right. "That depends," Michael said. "Are you ready to change, or are you just sorry you got caught?" Danny was quiet for a long moment, tracing patterns on the metal table with his finger. Around them, other families were having similar conversations. Mothers crying while their sons promised to do better, wives standing by husbands who'd made terrible choices, children visiting fathers who'd let them down one too many times. "I think about her a lot in here," Danny said finally. "Sarah. I think about all the things she did for me that I never thanked her for. Like when I got arrested for shoplifting, and she drove down to the jail at 2 in the morning to bail me out. She didn't lecture me or make me feel worse than I already did. She just brought me home and made pancakes. Michael remembered that night. Sarah had been furious with Danny, but had hidden it behind practical concern, getting him cleaned up, fed, and registered for the counseling sessions the court had mandated. Later, she'd cried in their bedroom, wondering what they'd done wrong as parents. "She never gave up on you," Michael said. "Even when I wanted to wash my hands of the whole situation, she kept believing you'd figure it out eventually. I let her die thinking I was a piece of shit." "Language," Michael said. "But yeah, Danny, you did."
She spent her last weeks worrying about you instead of focusing on her own peace. Danny's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't try to wipe them away. "I can't fix that, can I? I can't go back and be at her funeral or tell her I'm sorry or any of it." "No, you can't. So what do I do now? How do I live with knowing I was that selfish?" It was the first time Michael had heard his son take real responsibility for his actions without making excuses or blaming someone else. Maybe jail had given Danny time to think without distractions, or maybe hitting rock bottom had finally broken through his wall of denial. "You learn from it," Michael said. "You become the kind of person she believed you could be, even if she's not here to see it. Will you help me? If I take the plea deal and get out, will you help me figure out how to be better?" Michael looked at his son through the scratched glass, this young man who'd caused him so much pain and disappointment, but who was still, somehow, his child. Sarah's child in all the ways that mattered. "Here's what's going to happen," Michael said. "Your stepmother left you $5,000 in her will. You're going to use that money to pay me back for the tools. Then you're going to get a job, a real job, and keep it for at least 6 months. You're going to break up with Crystal and anyone else who encourages your worst impulses. And you're going to write a letter to Sarah." "A letter? Dad, I know she's dead. But you're going to write to her anyway. You're going to tell her about all the ways you let her down, and you're going to promise her and yourself that you'll do better. Then you're going to read that letter every time you're tempted to take the easy way out." Danny nodded slowly. "Okay, yeah, I can do that. I'm not finished. You're also going to complete your GED if you haven't already, and then you're going to learn a trade. Plumbing, electrical work, HVAC repair, something that will give you a skill set people will pay for. And you're going to stay clean. No drugs, no alcohol, no gambling, no get-rich-quick schemes." "That's a lot of conditions, Dad." "It's a lot less than you deserve, considering what you've put this family through." Michael leaned forward, pressing his palm against the glass. "But if you do all of that, if you really change, not just promise to change, then maybe we can have a relationship again. Maybe you can become someone Sarah would be proud of." Danny pressed his own palm against the glass, matching his father's gesture. Through the barrier, Michael could see his own hands reflected back at him, calloused and scarred from 30 years of manual labor, overlapping with Danny's younger, softer fingers. "I want to try," Danny said. "I really want to try this time." "Then call your lawyer and tell him you'll take the deal." Michael left the jail feeling lighter than he had since Sarah's diagnosis, as if some weight he'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Danny would have to earn that through actions, not words. But it was something like hope, the possibility that Sarah's faith in her stepson might not have been misplaced after all. 6 months later, Michael stood in his garage organizing his new tool collection. The replacements weren't as good as what he'd lost. Budget brands instead of professional grade, basic models instead of the deluxe sets he'd accumulated over decades. But they were his, bought with his own money and arranged according to his own system. Danny had been out of jail for 4 months, working the day shift at a muffler shop and taking GED classes at night. He'd broken up with Crystal after she suggested he steal car parts from his new employer and had moved into an efficiency apartment near the community college where he planned to study automotive technology. The letter to Sarah sat framed on his kitchen table, 3 pages of handwritten apology and promises that he read every morning with his coffee.
"Dad?" Danny's voice came from the driveway, tentative as always these days. "You in there?" "Come on in," Michael called, not looking up from the socket wrench he was cleaning. Danny appeared in the doorway, carrying a cardboard box and wearing the uniform shirt from his job. He'd gained some healthy weight since getting out of jail, and his eyes had stayed clear. The bruise from his first week inside had faded, leaving behind a small scar near his left temple that served as a permanent reminder of how low he'd sunk. "What's in the box?" Michael asked. "Early Christmas present." Danny set the box on the workbench and stepped back, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Found it at an estate sale last weekend. Guy was selling off his dad's stuff." Michael opened the box and found a pristine Craftsman socket set, still in its original case with all the pieces accounted for. It wasn't exactly like the one Danny had stolen, but it was close enough to make Michael's throat tight with emotion. "Serial number's right there on the case," Danny said, pointing to a small sticker. "I wrote it down for you, in case you want to add it to your notebook." Michael ran his fingers over the polished chrome sockets, remembering the satisfaction of having the right tool for every job. "This must have cost you a week's pay." "2 weeks, actually. But I figured I owed you more than just money." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, father and son, sharing space in the garage where their relationship had nearly ended. Outside, leaves were turning colors, and football season was starting, and life was moving forward the way it always did, regardless of individual tragedies and triumphs. "I drove by the cemetery yesterday," Danny said suddenly. "Put flowers on Sarah's grave. Daisies. I remembered they were her favorite." Michael nodded. He'd been visiting Sarah's grave every Sunday since the funeral, bringing fresh flowers and updates about Danny's progress. It was probably silly, talking to a headstone, but it helped him process the complicated grief of losing someone who'd been both his greatest love and his greatest frustration. "I told her about the job, and about school, and about this," Danny continued, gesturing toward the socket set. "I told her I was trying to be the person she thought I could be." "What do you think she would have said?" Danny smiled, the first genuine smile Michael had seen from him in years. She would have said it was about damn time. They both laughed, and for a moment it felt like old times, like the days when Danny was small and eager to help, when Sarah was alive and optimistic, when the future seemed full of possibilities instead of pitfalls. "I have something for you too," Michael said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Sarah's letter, the one she wrote to go with your inheritance." Danny took the envelope with trembling hands. He'd known about the money for months, had used it to pay restitution, just as Michael had planned, but he'd never seen Sarah's actual words. "She wrote this while she was sick?" Danny asked. "The week before she died. She was on a lot of pain medication, but her handwriting was still perfect. You know how she was about penmanship." Danny opened the envelope carefully and unfolded 3 pages of Sarah's neat cursive. Michael couldn't see the words from his angle, but he'd read them enough times to have them memorized. "My dear Danny, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and your father has decided you're ready to inherit the money I've saved for you. I hope that day comes sooner rather than later, because I believe in your ability to change and grow and become the man I've always known you could be. I want you to know that being your stepmother has been one of the greatest joys of my life. From the day you walked into our house at 7 years old, scared and angry and convinced that everyone would eventually abandon you, you've been my son in every way that matters. I've watched you struggle with demons I don't fully understand, and I've made mistakes in how I've tried to help you, but I've never stopped loving you, and I never will. The money in this account represents years of saving, small amounts set aside from grocery budgets and birthday gifts and part-time teaching jobs. I want you to use it wisely.
Not for quick fixes or temporary solutions, but for building a foundation for the rest of your life. Go back to school, learn a trade, find work that gives you purpose and pride. And most importantly, learn to forgive yourself for the mistakes you've made so you can move forward without the weight of guilt holding you back. I know your father will be angry with you for a while. He loves you fiercely, but he's tired of watching you hurt yourself and the people who care about you. Be patient with him. Show him through your actions, not your words, that you're serious about changing. He needs to see that his faith in you isn't misplaced. Remember the fishing trips we used to take when you were small? You always wanted to throw the little fish back, even when your father said they were big enough to keep. You had compassion even then, a gentleness that I've always hoped would win out over your harder impulses. That boy is still in there somewhere, Danny. Find him again. I'm not afraid of dying, but I am afraid of leaving you before you found your way. Promise me you'll keep trying, even when it's hard, even when you fail. Promise me you'll be kind to yourself and to others. Promise me you'll remember that you are loved, always and unconditionally. Your stepmother, but really your mom, Sarah. Danny read the letter twice, tears streaming down his face. When he finished, he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope, holding it against his chest like a talisman. "She really believed in me," he said quietly. "Even after everything I did, she still believed." "She did," Michael confirmed, "and so do I, son. So do I." They worked together for the next hour, organizing tools and cleaning the garage, talking about Danny's classes and his plans for the future. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened for them to simply pick up where they'd left off years ago. But it was something new, something built on honesty and accountability rather than hope and denial. As the sun set and they prepared to close up the garage for the night, Danny paused at the workbench where his gift still sat in its box. "Dad, I know I can't undo what I did. I can't bring Sarah back or take back the things I said or give you back the time you wasted worrying about me. But I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to earn the love you and Sarah gave me. Both of you deserved better than what I gave you." Michael looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw not the selfish young man who'd robbed him 6 months ago, but the earnest boy who'd once fallen asleep in this very garage while Michael worked late into the night. The boy Sarah had loved so fiercely, who'd been buried under years of bad choices and worse influences, but who'd never really disappeared. "You already are earning it," Michael said. "Every day you show up to work, every night you go to class, every time you choose to do the right thing instead of the easy thing, you're earning it." Danny nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I miss her, Dad. I miss Sarah so much." "Me too, son. Me too." They locked up the garage together and walked toward the house, where Michael would make dinner for two for the first time since Sarah's death. It wasn't the family he'd planned on having at this stage of his life. He'd imagined grandchildren by now, holiday gatherings with multiple generations, the kind of legacy that Sarah had dreamed about in her final weeks. But it was the family he had, damaged and complicated and real. In the kitchen, Danny helped set the table while Michael heated up leftover chili. They ate mostly in silence, comfortable with each other's company in a way they hadn't been for years. When they finished, Danny insisted on washing the dishes while Michael read the newspaper, a small gesture of consideration that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "I should probably head home," Danny said when the kitchen was clean. "Gotta be at work early tomorrow. Mr. Rodriguez wants me to help with the inventory." "Drive careful," Michael said, walking him to the door. "And Danny, thanks for the socket set. It means more than you know." Danny hugged his father goodbye, another small miracle in a year that had been full of them. Michael watched from the front porch as Danny's Honda pulled out of the driveway, noting that the ridiculous chrome rims had been replaced with practical steel wheels that wouldn't attract thieves or cops.
Inside, Michael sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and Sarah's insurance papers, finalizing the last details of her estate. Most of her belongings had been donated to charity, but a few special items remained. Her collection of first-edition children's books, her grandmother's china, the photo albums that documented 30 years of family life. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the pictures he'd taken at Danny's graduation from the GED program the week before. His son in cap and gown, grinning widely as he held his diploma. Danny with his boss from the muffler shop who'd taken the afternoon off to attend the ceremony. Danny standing next to Sarah's grave afterward, reading his letter one more time before tucking it carefully back into his jacket. Sarah would have been so proud, Michael thought. She would have cried happy tears and insisted on taking 100 photos, and probably would have embarrassed Danny by bragging to every stranger within earshot. Her absence at such moments still felt like a physical ache, but it was tempered now by the knowledge that her faith in Danny hadn't been wasted. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from his sister in Arizona. "How's Danny doing with his new job?" "Good," he typed back. "Really good. Sarah would be pleased." She always knew he'd figure it out eventually. You both did, even when it didn't seem like it. Michael smiled and set the phone aside. Tomorrow he would visit Sarah's grave, bringing fresh flowers and news of Danny's latest small victories. He would tell her about the socket set and the way their son had hugged him goodbye and the plans they were making to work on the truck together over the weekend. She wouldn't answer, of course, but he liked to think she was listening somewhere, satisfied that the two men she'd loved most had finally found their way back to each other. It had taken loss and consequences and more pain than any family should have to endure, but they'd made it through to something that looked like forgiveness, something that felt like hope. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows and scattered leaves across the yard Sarah had tended so carefully. Inside, Michael finished his coffee and turned off the lights, secure in the knowledge that some things, the important things, could be rebuilt if you were patient enough to let them heal properly. The tools might have been replaceable, but the relationship they'd cost him had been worth fighting for after all.